Hi, I'm Andy Baccaro, and I'm the director of Project Courage, an adolescent and adult substance abuse treatment facility in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. And I'm here today on behalf of East Haddam Youth and Family Services to talk about um, marijuana use among adolescents. And I'm happy to be invited and to get this chance to speak. So, probably one of the most common things, for better or worse, that I hear these days is that pot's not a drug or marijuana isn't even a drug. And I think that this line of thinking stems from a kind of old but very resilient idea, and that's that addiction has a psychological component and a physiological one. And we hear that all the time, right? We hear that pot is just psychologically addicting. But brain imaging over the last 30 years has really shown that the notion that we can split addiction into a physiological and a psychological component is really misinformative and is really damaging. And the main reason for this is that anytime I ingest any substance, and pot is included in this, I start to create a change in my brain. First, at a molecular level, things we may have heard about, chemicals in the brain, neurotransmitters, hormones, neuromodulators. And then if I use again and consistently enough, those changes at the molecular level will become changes at the cellular level. So, in other words, now my brain cells start to change the way they work and how they produce those chemicals. And then if I use again and consistently enough, the brain cells will change how they connect to one another. And so now we talk about impacting connectivity and how different parts of our brain communicate. And then finally, if I continue to use, there'll be actual structural changes in my brain. So we start with the chemicals, then we go to the cells, then we go to the connections, and then we go to actual structure and the way our brain is shaped. Um, and so this might sound sort of gruesome, but if someone suffered a severe trauma to their head and their skull cracked and brain matter was oozing out, we wouldn't say that person's having a psychological problem. That's a physiological change that's going to cause significant impact to the functioning of that person's brain. And because these are closed skull changes, doesn't mean that the structural changes aren't significant and that they're not creating huge impacts. So, at first glance, this might seem like a minor technicality, but subscribing to this idea that there's a psychological and a physiological addiction allows us to do a very American thing of comparing drugs based on that. And we have come to the conclusion based on that myth that drugs that create a physiological dependence are much worse and cause people to be much more desperate and have much worse problems than drugs that are quote unquote just psychologically addicting. But listen, if we were somehow able to safely take everybody in the country that had a substance use disorder and put them on an island where they, after 5 or 7 days, any substance they ingested or had an addiction to would be out of their body, right? So, in other words, they no longer have a lot of those physiological symptoms that we see, like the sweats or shakes or flu like symptoms. But we know what would happen the moment we took those folks and we brought them back to their homes and their families. The bulk of them would go back to using their substance. And that's because of the physiological change that's happened in the brain that lasts much longer than anything that happens in the body. So, when we think about a drug like cocaine or heroin, which leads to acute and rapid consequences, oftentimes we feel that, well, marijuana is just psychologically addicting. It doesn't have those rapid and acute consequences. And so it's just not bad compared to some of those other drugs. But is it really fair to say that one drug that leads to acute and rapid consequences, while another one that leads to maybe more subtle and measured consequences is better or worse? Um, I like to use the metaphor of two houses, right? If we built one house on a fault line that's prone to earthquakes, and we built another house in a acid rain zone, Um, the individual with the house with the earthquakes at some point is going to have a cold glass of water in the face, so to speak. They're going to have an earthquake. There's going to be severe damage to their house. It's going to be undeniable. And that person might say, you know what? I don't want to live with this anymore. I'm young still. I haven't grown too attached to this setting. I still have the financial resources. I'm moving and I'm going to find another place. While the house that's in that acid rain zone isn't going to necessarily see the consequences. And day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, those consequences compound and pile up. And one day I realized that my house is no longer habitable. But now I've spent 20 years living here and I don't want to leave. And I don't necessarily have the resources to just get up and move. And I'm older now, and moving is going to take more of a toll on my body. So just because the acuity, onset, and duration is more different for one substance, I wouldn't want to be the one to say it's no less damaging. And to maybe pull this point out a little further, let's take a look at some of the real life consequences with marijuana. So for most people, when they start using marijuana, there's a lot of naivety. There is what we might say a good time. We're not concerned about how much pot we are getting. We're not concerned about the quality of the pot. Um, and if I continue to use for a little bit, um, I'm taking precautions. I'm going somewhere safe, like in the woods or to a house, a friend's house where their parents aren't home, whose parents also get high. I'm going with people who've gotten high before. I'm usually going with somebody that I trust, a good friend or a sibling. And as I continue to use, some of those things might start to change. Maybe now when I go out, ask my mom for $20 and I tell her it's because I'm going to the movies or to get some food. And when I get in the car with my friends, I throw my $20 into the pool so that we can get a bigger bag of pot that night. And now maybe what's happening when I use is I'm not taking some of those precautions. I'm not going outside. In fact, I'm upstairs in my room. I'm blowing my hitters or exhaling out the window. I have a towel under the door. And my reasoning is it's too much work to go outside and it's going to be a buzzkill for me in the winter to get high while I'm outside. And you can start to see how these things, like taking $20 from my mom, is much easier to wrap my head around and to rationalize than someone like maybe who has a heroin addiction and steals a ring from their mother's jewelry cabinet. And as I continue to get high, maybe what starts to happen is I do start to get a little more preoccupied with how much pot I have. If I have enough pot at the end of the night, that's maybe going to get me and a friend high, but definitely is enough for me. And a good friend of mine says, "Hey, do you have any pot?" I instinctively shake my head no, because while it may be enough for both of us, it's definitely enough for me. And I need to make sure I can get high when I get home so that I can get to sleep at night. And maybe now what's happening is I'm not able to safely predict, or maybe I should say accurately predict how much I'm going to get high too. So, for example, after school, I tell myself I'm just going to smoke one bowl today. For whatever reason, maybe I have a paper I have to get done, or maybe last time my mom caught me and I don't want to get caught again. But the next thing I know, 2 or 3 hours have passed and I've smoked 2 or 3 bowls instead of just the one. And I blow right past that limit I set for myself. And maybe now I'm with the same people in the same places at the same times, getting high on a regular basis. And I'm not as willing to put myself out there, to be as vulnerable, to take risks. Um, and maybe now I'm experiencing a craving, but it's hard to tell because it's a whisper. It's not a shout or a scream like other substances like cocaine or heroin. Instead, it's sort of like an old friend that comes up and puts its arm around my back and says, "Hey, wouldn't it be nice to get high today? Wouldn't it be nice? Wait, can't wait till school's over. I can get high. Or can't wait till lunch when I can leave and go get high." And now maybe what's happened is I'm telling myself everything's better when I'm high, and I don't realize what I'm really saying is I'm only okay when I'm high. So I'm regulated by this substance, my relationships, my mood, who I choose to be with, my sense of security, my ability to sleep, my choices, my desires. I've really started to gravitate around my use in smoking pot. But unfortunately or fortunately, I'll let you be the judge. This isn't sexy enough to catch our attention. It's not drug cartels or shootings or violence or robbing stores or overdoses. So we don't even notice it's happening. Um, and it's not just the people who are using the substance, it's really our culture. And so this is what we see and what happens for a lot of our clients, but it's tough for them to acknowledge or reconcile the idea that they need to change because, again, it feels like pot's not even really a drug. And then there finally is the concept of pot leading or priming the brain for other substances. And there's been a lot of debate about this. And typically that debate comes back to this data right here that comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that shows about half of the people who use substances only smoke pot. Then you have about 20% of that people who smoke pot and other use other substances. And then you have about 25% who uh, stopped smoking pot and just use other substances. And oftentimes, this is the argument that's used to see for people to say, see, look, pot really isn't a gateway drug because most of the people who use substances only smoke pot. But that sort of denies another half of the argument, which, that 45% that go on to use other substances all acknowledge using alcohol and marijuana before making the leap to using other substances. There's always exceptions, without a doubt. There are people that skip past alcohol and marijuana and move into harder substances, as we like to say. But that is very much an exception. So, and we know what happens in the brain when we introduce a substance like marijuana because it impacts the same parts of the brain that cocaine and heroin does. It sets it up for continued use, whether it's with pot or with another substance. So I hope we can reconsider the idea that marijuana is not a drug, and be responsible enough if we're going to make the choice to use marijuana to at least acknowledge that it is a drug, and that it has consequences attached to it. But in some ways, they're no better or worse than other drugs. They just play out differently. So thanks for taking the time today. Please feel free to reach out if you had any questions. Your contact information for myself and East Haddam Youth and Family Services will be shown to you, and we're happy to help. Thanks for taking the time.